Hello everyone, you're listening to Alternative Revelations with Linda Emmanuel. And this is podcast number 18, all about anemia, how mycoplasma causes the body to get anemia, all explained in simple detail. But before I get started, I have to recite this disclaimer, which is required by the FDA. I am not a doctor, nor am I a licensed practitioner. I am not allowed to give medical advice, and these podcasts are for informational purposes only. And with this said, I can now begin the podcast. Now, if you're wondering how mycoplasma causes anemia, there is an explanation, and it is all, once you hear it, it's very logical, and once you understand it, you'll understand it. I've researched mycoplasma now for 13 years. I've read everything I can get my hands on. Of course, you have to decipher between junk science and the real science. And doctors, if you go to your doctor and ask if you have a mycoplasma infection and you have anemia, your doctor will not be able to tell you why you have anemia, because doctors usually do not know about mycoplasma. They think cancer and disease are caused by inflammation, or in the case of autoimmune diseases, they think the body or the immune system is attacking itself, which sounds like garbage from the Middle Ages. So now that I've kind of spouted off about the medical industry, let's get started and you'll understand why people who have mycoplasma infections become anemic. And here goes. First, I'm going to have to go through some definitions, but first I'm going to recite this from my book. I'm going to be reading this actually from my book, Alternative Revelations. Now, all life forms need iron. Bacteria use iron as coenzymes and DNA synthesis, which means replication. Over time, bacteria have developed mechanisms for the intake of iron when their environment is not hospitable. And I'm going to read you some stages of how mycoplasma, for example, cause chronic anemia in humans. And I first have to go over some definitions, and some of these definitions you'll recognize the words, but I'm going to have to explain some of the definitions so when I'm telling you about the anemia that you'll understand it. And the first definition is anaerobic respiration. And if you remember from previous podcast that mycoplasma is anaerobic, it does not use oxygen. It is anaerobic, meaning it does not use oxygen. So anaerobic respiration is used by bacteria which do not use oxygen to make energy. And if you remember why we breathe oxygen, we need oxygen to dispose of our carbon and our hydrogen, which makes CO2 and H2O, and therefore can be eliminated from the body. But bacteria use sulfate, nitrate, sulfur, or fumitrate as electron acceptors, which manufacture far less energy than aerobic respiration. Now, the next definition is, of course, anemia, and it's usually defined in three ways. Number one, as a decrease in the amount of red blood cells in the blood. Two, the decreased amount of hemoglobin in the blood. Or three, a lowered ability of the blood to carry oxygen. Now, symptoms of anemia are tiredness, weakness, feeling faint, shortness of breath, or an inability to exercise, meaning strength. Now, the next definition is blood plasma. And blood plasma is the pale yellow liquid component of blood which holds the blood cells in suspension. Plasma makes up 55% of the body's total blood volume. It consists of 95% water and contains dissolved proteins, glucose, electrolytes, clotting factors, hormones, and CO2. Now, the next definition, you've heard me say the word cytokine, and cytokines were mentioned in the podcast about the flu pandemic of 2020. Now, a cytokine definition is a category of small proteins which are important in cell signaling. All cells with a nucleus produce cytokines. And for your information, red blood cells do not contain a nucleus. And they don't have a nucleus because they need to have the room to carry oxygen and hemoglobin and iron. Now the next definition is ferroportin, Ferroportin, and this is a really important definition. It is a transmembrane protein that transports iron from the inside of the cell, macrophages for example, to the outside of the cell. Now this ferroportin is inhibited by hepcidin, which is manufactured by the liver. Therefore, iron is not transported out of the macrophage. It is kept internalized. Now the next definition is hemoglobin, and it is an iron containing oxygen transport protein found in red blood cells and macrophages. It needs iron to carry oxygen. Now the next definition I mentioned to before, it's hepcidin, Hepcidin, and it's a hormone produced in the liver which reduces dietary iron absorption. Inflammation and the release of cytokines trigger the liver to release hepcidin. Hepcidin in turn inhibits ferroportin by binding to it, and it keeps it and the iron inside the macrophage, the main site of iron storage. Hepcidin also reduces iron absorption through the gut and reduces iron exit from the liver. The next definition is inflammation, and it is the initial bodily response to harmful stimuli which results in the increased movement of plasma and leukocytes, white blood cells, to the affected site. Now the next definition is iron, and iron is a potentially toxic substance, but it is important to human health and disease. Iron is a highly electrical acceptor receptor and is used to attract and carry oxygen to cells. Because it is so toxic by itself, life forms such as humans use proteins to bind and carry iron. If left free, iron catalyzes hydrogen peroxide into free radicals which can damage the cell and kill it. Macrophages break down and process old red blood cells. They recycle and store most of the iron in the body. Now the next definition are leukocytes, and they are white blood cells of the immune system, and they're used by the body to fight disease-causing pathogens. Used to repair the body, white blood cells are produced in the bone marrow. Now, there are 5 types of leukocytes, including monocytes and neutrophils. An increase in the number of white blood cells in the blood is an indicator of infection. And the next definition are macrophages, and they are a type of evolved monocytes, which are white blood cells, which are detrimental in the healing process, removing of debris and dying cells in the blood. And they also kill pathogens. When it retires a spent red blood cell by engulfing it, it then acts as an iron storage container. Later, it releases iron to newly formed red blood cells. And this is an interesting trivia. Macrophages can eat and digest up to 100 pathogens in its lifetime. Now, the next definition is a neutrophil, and they are a type of leukocyte. They are the first immune system cells to appear at an injured site or the site of an infection. Now, the next definition, you've heard of this, is red blood cells. They lack a cell nucleus to accommodate more room for hemoglobin. Now, this is some interesting information. 24 million new red blood cells are produced every second in human adults. They develop in the bone marrow and circulate 100 to 120 days, after which they are recycled by the macrophages. It takes a red blood cell only 20 seconds to travel a full circle in the human body. 1/4 of the cells in the body are red blood cells. They are the principal carrier of oxygen to the tissues. Now, red blood cells are very flexible, and when they squeeze through capillaries, this releases oxygen to the tissues. Now, the next definition is a pretty important one. It's called siderophores, siderophores, siderophores. And they are small, iron chelating compounds secreted by bacteria and fungi to absorb iron. They are amongst the strongest soluble binding electrical acceptor known to science. After bacteria such as mycoplasma release siderophores to catch iron, the bacteria reabsorb the siderophores along with the captured iron. So it sounds like mycoplasma has to have iron to metabolize, to replicate. And thankfully, that was the last definition. So again, you almost get the picture of what's going on here, that the when you have cytokines are released, which means that there's some kind of pathogen or foreign substance in the body, it triggers the liver to release hepcidin, hepcidin, which is a hormone which triggers the macrophages to hold on to iron and not release it. We have an infection. We do not want the mycoplasma to uptake the iron, because then mycoplasma can replicate. Mycoplasma absolutely needs iron to replicate. Okay, now I'm going to read you. There's about 3 or 4 stages of anemia. There's actually four stages. And I'm just going to really read this from my book, so you don't really need to buy my book. I'm just going to read the stages. And it's most interesting. Once you hear this, you'll probably never forget it. You might not remember all the words, but you'll know that when you have cytokines are released, meaning an infection, the liver produces the hormone hepcidin, which tells the macrophages to hold on to the iron and not release it. And then more white blood cells are being created instead of red blood cells. And the red blood cells that are being created, they're not getting the iron from the macrophages, and therefore you're not getting enough oxygen circulating in your tissues because of the infection. So it's kind of a no-win situation when you get a mycoplasma infection. A lot of times the body works against you. So the following are the four stages which eventually lead to death. Stage 1. Bacteria, mycoplasma for instance, invades a cell. The infected cells release cytokines. Remember, any cell with a nucleus can release cytokines, and this is a distress signal. And the first to appear on the scene are phagocytic neutrophils. Next to arrive are macrophages. Inflammatory cytokines are released, and inflammation, which is plasma, surrounds the infected tissue. More and more macrophages arrive at the site. Now, macrophages are responsible for engulfing and killing pathogens and repairing damaged tissues. They convert arginine to nitric oxide if they are fighting pathogens. For tissue repair, they convert arginine into ornithine. And I'm going to stop here for just a brief second. You've heard about people who want to heal their wounds. They're told to eat peanut butter, and peanut butter is high in arginine. And this is why when macrophages are repairing damaged or healing tissue, they use arginine. Macrophages are also the cleanup crew. They recycle iron when they eat and dispose of red blood cells at the end of the red blood cell's life cycle, which is around 120 days. Especially important, macrophages become the keepers of the iron and are responsible for releasing iron to newly manufactured red blood cells. Now here's stage 2. As inflammation increases due to the release of more cytokines and the inflammation increases, the liver starts releasing hepcidin, a hormone which inhibits macrophages from releasing iron into the bloodstream. This is a built-in safeguard to keep bacteria from accessing iron. Making iron scarce slows down bacteria growth. However, over time, this negatively affects the host. Here's stage 3. An increase in inflammation causes the bone marrow to produce more white blood cells instead of red blood cells. Due to the macrophages holding on to iron intentionally, newly created red blood cells are not receiving sufficient amounts of iron, which enables hemoglobin to transport oxygen to the now oxygen-starved cells. Symptoms of anemia begin to show up in the host. Bacteria secrete siderophores and steal iron from the hemoglobin and the plasma. As the infection worsens, chronic anemia manifests. Ultimately, less and less oxygen is getting to the cells, even though there are sufficient amounts of iron in storage. Less oxygen in the body causes mycoplasma to aggressively speed up even more. And if you remember, mycoplasma monitors 3 things in your body: your pH, your immune system, and the oxygen level in the body. The less oxygen in the body, the more mycoplasma gets aggressive. Now here's stage 4, the last stage. Suffering from chronic anemia, the host's heart is now overworked as it is forced to pump harder and harder to get more oxygen to the cells. This could lead to death, congestive heart failure. Cancer patients and the elderly are especially vulnerable. Now, this is an interesting comment. According to sources, blood transfusions are not the answer. New blood makes iron readily available to mycoplasma, which enable them to flourish and replicate even faster. So it all is logic and makes a lot of sense that it all starts with the cytokines being released because of the pathogens, and the macrophages and the other white blood cells rush to the site. And when more and more cytokines are released, it triggers the liver to release the hormone hepcidin, which tells the macrophages, hold on to the iron. We have a mycoplasma infection because the body has a safeguard against bacteria. Bacteria need iron as electron acceptors when they replicate and use for metabolism. So it seems like the more and more cytokines are released, more white blood cells are being created, and less red blood cells are being created. And the red blood cells that are being created are not receiving iron. And then the mycoplasmas are stealing the iron from the hemoglobin and the plasma. It's really interesting how people get the anemia, which leads to congestive heart failure. It causes the heart to pump harder and harder and harder because less and less oxygen is being carried to the cells because of the infection. And even though people who are anemic have iron in their bodies, but doctors can't explain why. They don't know that there is a mycoplasma infection. If they were trained in mycoplasma in the first place, they would instantly recognize what was going on. But they have no clue. It's very sad. So that wraps up episode 18. We're just moving right along. And I hope this was educational. I hope I explained it simply enough. It just goes to show you that mycoplasma needs iron, and the body has a mechanism to safeguard against releasing iron to the bacteria, but yet it works against itself, and over time the patient dies of congestive heart failure, or maybe even the congestive heart failure, they drown in their own inflammation in the lungs, and yet doctors have no clue. I swear, I know many people older people who have mycoplasma infections, and they get blood transfusions. What is wrong with our medical industry? It's a crime that they don't know, that they haven't been taught about mycoplasma. You really can't blame your doctor. It's the medical industry, it's the pharmaceuticals, it's the AMA that is at fault here for not educating doctors about mycoplasma. So now that I'm going to get off my soapbox and I'm going to end it here. I hope this was very educational, as it was very educational for me to understand why people who have mycoplasma infections are anemic. So until next time, good night and God bless.